I am Flavia Zimmermann of the Australian Institute of International Affairs in Western Australia, and today we have with us Professor Amr Hamzawy. Professor Amr is going to explain current political trends in Egypt and a trend towards political authoritarianism. Good to have you with us, Professor. Professor, can you please explain your experience in Egypt and to which extent the 2011 Arabic Spring has been successful in the country?
Well, what happened in 2011 to 2012 was that we did have a brief democratic opening in Egypt following the democratic uprising, following the 18 days between January 25th and February 11th, 2011. The 18 days ended with the removal of former President Mubarak, and we had a brief democratic opening. However, Egypt has been backsliding on its initial democratic process since a military coup was performed in July 2013. So the quick wins which we did have in Egypt right after the uprising have evaporated. We are looking at an authoritarian build-up, unmatched with previous governments in Egypt. And unfortunately, it's even more of a worse situation when we compare human rights abuses and violations today to the situation prior to the democratic uprising. So it's quite a tragic development we're looking at.
And in your opinion, which were the main root causes for the failure between transition from the Mubarak's authoritarian regime towards democratization in Egypt?
Yes, there were different root causes. Definitely there were different strategic and tactical mistakes committed by key political actors. And Egypt was ruled since the 1950s, since the first coup of the Egyptian army in 1952 and until 2011, primarily by military officers who were in the presidential palace. And Egypt was ruled by different autocratic governments, sometimes with the military establishment single-handedly, sometimes in alliance with different civilian elites. Political actors which emerged in Egypt against that background were of two types. One was an Islamist spectrum, which all the way from moderate to less moderate was comprised of different movements. The most well-known of them is the Muslim Brotherhood. And the second spectrum was a secular spectrum, with liberal and leftist parties. However, when 2011 happened and the democratic opening was the result of citizens demanding their political rights in the 18 days of the revolution, or the uprising as it has come to be termed, political actors were not ready to push Egypt in the direction of an orderly transition to democracy. There was a great deal of fighting, a great deal of identity debates, ideological fights, and the big questions which should have been around how to tackle the military establishment, the real powerhouse in place, were not addressed. I believe that the middle classes supported the democratic transition at the beginning, gave up on it later because they did not benefit from the democratic opening in 2011, 2012, and 2013. They saw the living conditions deteriorating, their economic and social benefits declining, and therefore it was quite a normal change that they switched gears and moved away from buying into the democratic process into becoming more in favor of calling back on the army to interfere.
Thank you so much, Professor. Fascinating to understand a little bit more of these root causes. You argue that around 400 laws have been enacted over the last 4 years, and to which extent there is a deliberate move in Egypt to undermine the current institutions and to redesign political institutions in Egypt?
This is exactly what has been happening since the coup in July 2013. So to look at Egypt today, 4 years after the coup, one has to use two prisms to understand Egyptian political realities. One is look at the direct repression which the government using its security services intelligence agencies has been implicated in. There are massive human rights abuses and violations, quantity-wise, unmatched in previous decades in Egypt since the 1950s. But even in terms of the quality of human rights crimes, we are looking at new types of human rights crimes, forced disappearances, extrajudicial killings, a very high frequency of torture cases in prison and places of custody. So one prism is to look at, will take you to look at the direct repression which this government has been implementing since 2013. A second prism is to look at the indirect repression, and here are the significant issues pertaining to the laws. So this government has been introducing a new legal framework to enable it to close off the public space, to sideline activism away from formal political spheres, parliaments or elsewhere, because we do have a national parliament and we do have different municipal councils at the local levels. So politics is no longer part of what we're looking at. This is no longer about pluralism or pluralist contestation. So one way to close off the public space, to take the energy of citizens away from politics, to increase the imbalance between military and security components in the Egyptian state apparatus vis-a-vis civilian components. So it's no longer really about ministries or different agencies of the government. Power is concentrated in military and security hands within the state apparatus. And finally, to re-inject and reintroduce fear as a constant feature of Egyptian reality. So therefore, they enacted that huge number of laws, on average 100 per year. And what's remarkable as well is the fact that most of them have been presidential decree laws issued by the current president, Mr. Sisi, and by the former interim president who directly followed the coup, and Parliament approved all of them. So yes, this mounts to a new design of state-society relations, which enables the government to reach its goals and increase, as I was saying, the imbalance between military security components and civilian components within the state apparatus.
Thank you very much, Professor. Could you please just expand a little bit more the issue of current human rights violations, and particularly freedom of press in Egypt? How is exactly the situation on the ground?
Well, I believe since we are here in Australia, at least maybe some in Australia will remember the incident of the Australian journalist who was arrested in Egypt for several months and in fact was sentenced to an imprisonment punishment and was later pardoned by the president and sent back home. His case became well known because of the international aspect of it. Unfortunately, however, there are many cases of Egyptian journalists who have been jailed, imprisoned, detained throughout the last 4 years, and no one has taken note. Egypt is the second worst country in terms of jailing journalists, following only China, and coming before Turkey. So the shame list is a trilateral list with China followed by Egypt and Egypt followed by Turkey. These are the worst jailers, harassers of journalists, and it gives you a sense of the situation of freedom of expression in general, especially when it comes to media outlets, be it print media or televised media or electronic media. Egypt, this government has been doing and exerting great efforts to increase its surveillance of the media landscape, buying in a very wild manner surveillance technologies from wherever it can put its hand on, and in fact using new surveillance technologies to track down who is saying what, even away from the media. Even citizens, when they express their views freely, they stand unfortunately the risk of being harassed, detained. We have cases of young Egyptians uploading on a website a funny music video making fun of some politicians, including the president. They landed in prison and were detained for 6 months. I believe a court process is awaiting them. They were released a couple of weeks ago. So in a way, when it comes to freedom of expression, freedom of the press, freedom of Egyptian citizens to express their views freely, This is a very dire situation we're looking at.
Thank you, Professor. It is a recurrent theme, the issue of fear and, I dare to say, state-sponsored, fear towards its citizens. To which extent, if you compromise the rule of law, if you compromise separation of powers of government, and you remove individual rights, to which extent there is still some resistance in Egypt towards this trend?
Well, I mean, this is a tired country which has been going through a roller coaster since 2011. Great hopes in the direction of an emerging democratic transition. Great hopes were depressed. Even between 2011 and 2013, we had incidents of mass killing of Egyptians, at least two big incidents in which big numbers of Egyptians were killed. One was a state-sponsored incident of violence in which Egyptian Copts, Egyptian Christians demonstrating against the burning of churches were in fact killed during what was a peaceful demonstration by army and police units. And a second incident of killing of a big number of Egyptians, dozens of Egyptians, happened in Sinai prior to 2013, where terrorist groups attacked army and police officers. So in a way, this was a country prior to the coup struggling to keep its hopeful outlook after the democratic uprising, struggling to sustain a positive take on what was happening, but this was very, very difficult. And when you factor in the deterioration of social and economic conditions, it gives you a sense of maybe why Egyptian middle class, urban middle classes demanded that the army takes over and gave up on the democratic transition. Now, with this current government and the increase in direct and indirect repression, of course, it's very difficult for any society to bounce back, to come back and try to figure out what new forms of activism can be introduced to counter the repressive urge and drive of the current government. In spite of how tiring it is, there are new forms of activism emerging in Egypt, primarily in relation to the labor movement, student movements in public universities, alternative music and art scene, which is very vibrant, and some young activists are establishing, once again, and rediscovering the activism of professional unions, trade unions, and so on and so forth. So there are embryonic forms of activism against the background of a tight and repressive grip of the current ruling establishment over politics and society. However, it's too early to judge where these new forms, embryonic forms of activism will go, whether they will mount to a real resistance to the autocracy, will mount to a real change to the autocracy, or will be sidelined and killed by the autocracy, because it's once again trying as well to invade and penetrate those spaces and kill the emerging activism.
Thank you very much, Professor. So, if we make a comparison between the former authoritarian, the former shape of authoritarianism that we had with Mubarak and current authoritarian trends in Egypt, what we've got now, is it worse than what we had before with Mubarak, or in the end of the day, what is, let's say, the legacy of the Arabic Spring in Egypt?
I believe that Egyptian developments should not be generalized to push forward a legacy for the Arab Spring. The Arab Spring has been unfolding in different Arab countries, all the way from Tunisia to Egypt, Libya in between, to Yemen, Syria, Bahrain, even a bit of activism in Lebanon. So there are multiple legacies for the Arab Spring, and the legacy of Tunisia is a different one. They do have an orderly democratic process up until today, with different deficits, but still going in the direction of respecting the big objective of establishing democratically legitimated institutions and running state-society relations through them, not away from them. The legacy of Egypt is a legacy of backsliding to worse times. When you compare to the previous regime of former President Mubarak, we did not have the same quantitatively nor qualitatively the same degree of repression. Unlike the situation today, the legacy of Yemen is a legacy of a civil war. The legacy in Syria is a legacy of a bloody dictator killing his people and leading to the militarization of the uprising and global actors not caring, apart from a global power which decided to interfere militarily on the side of the dictator. I'm referring to Russia. The legacy in Bahrain has been a legacy of killing the democratic uprising regionally. Saudi troops marched in and killed the democratic uprising. And what followed is a massive repressive scene emerging in Bahrain, targeting primarily activists, human rights organizations, and voices of dissent. So there are many legacies in the Arab Spring, and I believe anyone who observes the region from afar, who is not a specialist on the region, should be very cautious before extrapolating from any one of these cases general legacy for the Arab Spring.
Absolutely, thank you very much. And just perhaps expanding a little bit more on the fact that in Egypt, most of the legislation that has been enacted over the last 4 years was enacted through decrees, didn't go through the appropriate legislative procedure, and this is a confirmation of the authoritarian trend in the country. If we make a comparison with the situation in Egypt and possibly the situation in the United States that Donald Trump seems to be overusing executive orders, which are the equivalent of the rule by decree, do you think the United States are also possibly moving towards a more authoritarian form of government?
Well, it's technically not right to say that issuing presidential decree laws was outside of the scope of the legal framework. The legal framework in Egypt allows Egyptian presidents to issue presidential decree laws in two cases. One, when you do not have a sitting parliament, and that was the case in Egypt after the coup between July 2013 and January 2016. So in a way, technically speaking, they did not ignore the legal framework on the ground. The second case in which Egyptian presidents can issue presidential decree laws are in issues pertaining to national security questions. But in the two cases, when they issue presidential decree laws, the legal framework mandates that Parliament approves or disapproves. So they continue to be enacted laws. If Parliament disapproves, a new process of consultation, legal work will have to happen. The trouble was that the interim president in Egypt, who served between July 2013 and 2014, summer of 2014, and the current president, who is in office since the summer of 2014, used their legislative prerogatives to issue a huge number of laws, to redesign the legal framework and the state-society relations and take it in a more of an autocratic direction. The problem was as well that Parliament basically approved all of the presidential decree laws apart from one. So the exact number was 342 presidential decree laws. Parliament came into its first session in January 2017. It approved 341, most of which are laws which undermine safeguards for freedom of expression, freedom of association, and citizens' rights and freedoms in general. I believe one should not compare between any democratic setting and any autocratic setting in the sense of how presidents or executive branches of government overplay their prerogatives. There are tendencies, of course, from the current US administration to overplay its executive prerogatives. It's interesting to see how the judiciary is stopping that at different levels and how media is stopping that at different levels. In Egypt, when you look at an autocratic setting, unfortunately that goes unchallenged. That was not challenged in Parliament. It's only briefly challenged in the judiciary. And therefore, it really comes down to what Egyptian citizens will do, whether they will build on the embryonic forms of activism I was just referring to and push forward a challenge, a contestation to the autocratic government, or whether this government will continue to get away with what it's doing.
Thank you very much, Professor. And one thing that would be very interesting just to reflect upon, to which extent the international community has been raising awareness to human rights violations in Egypt and to the fact that the institutional framework is being redesigned?
When you look at the policies of the international community vis-à-vis Egypt, I believe it's important to differentiate between governments and non-governmental organizations. Non-governmental organizations have been very active, especially human rights organizations, in criticizing what has been unfolding in Egypt since 2013. So as an Egyptian, I cannot blame human rights organizations because they have been attentive to what's happening. Maybe they did not get all of the details. Once again, this is a massive legal work to issue close to 400 laws in 4 years. Maybe they were not attentive to every single piece of legislation, but in general they did put out the right tones in criticizing the autocratic urge and drive of the current Egyptian government. What has been missing since the coup is more of a proactive role from the international community at the government level to push back against the growing autocracy in Egypt. Most Western countries put forward their economic and trade interests and security concerns ahead of taking human rights issues in Egypt seriously. That applies to Europe, to the US, it applies to most developed nations which do have trade and economic interests in Egypt. At the government-to-government level, regionally as well, there were attempts by key regional actors to undermine the Egyptian democratic transition and to side with the military taking over in July 2013, referring primarily to Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates. And so in general, Egypt has become, at the government level, an issue where I believe the bottom line is, as long as this government is delivering in the sense of cooperating on counter-terrorism activities, cooperating on undermining illegal immigration, cooperating in the Mediterranean in a security-driven manner with European nations, and cooperation with Israel, which is very important from a US perspective. As long as this is happening, no one basically cares about human rights.
Very interesting. Thank you very much, Professor Amr. And thank you for being with us. And for more information on the Australian Institute of International Affairs, please visit our website, www.internationalaffairs.org.au. Thank you.